All right, I'm going to share my screen real quick.
Right.
And do a little bit of setup here. And the setup is this. Salesperson performance is something that I think at first glance can seem very obvious, very intuitive on how you would measure it, right? The better salesperson is the one with the bigger number, right? That should be the end of the conversation. However, it's not. Things get actually a lot trickier than that when you get just a pinch below the surface. And I have some slides from a B2B marketing and sales course I was teaching about a year ago. And we call this a sales rep comparability problem. And just in the way of setup, we'll present you with some numbers from two sales reps, Good Glinda and Bad Biff. And Good Glinda is an excellent sales rep. She just exceeds performance goals. She is a superstar in the organization. People look up to her. People want to be her. She is on fire. All right. Bad Biff, not the case. Okay. Bad Biff, bad performance numbers, not meeting or exceeding the goals that are set before him. Nobody wants to be him. People are kind of embarrassed that he represents the company. He is in all ways a bad rep. But you can see their numbers here. They both sold 15 million this year. They both acquired 30 new accounts this year. They both kept their expenses pretty low. And the question then is, why are we saying that one of these people with the exact same performance measures are good and the other one is good and the other is bad? Well, it's because there are an awful lot of different things that play into a salesperson's performance number. Now, the easiest one to talk about is probably territory potential, right? So we go back up to these numbers. Well, maybe Good Glinda is good because she achieved these performance numbers in a territory with a lot less potential, right? She's maybe in a more rural area or has a larger geographic footprint that she has to cover to see these accounts. And she's selling 15 million this year in an area where we wouldn't really expect her to be able to sell 15 million, right? Whereas Biff, maybe he's in the middle of New York City, he's right in the heart of Manhattan, and 15 million is a drop in the bucket for his market potential. And he is really only working 1 or 2 days a week to achieve this level of performance. And yeah, both are pretty big dollars. If we just look at them in a spreadsheet and we don't know those contextual details, it would be really easy to say, yeah, they're probably doing the same. But jumping back down to this slide, yeah, it turns out there's a lot of things that affect performance. And we want to celebrate the people who are doing really well, whose efforts are driving their performance and success. We don't really want to celebrate somebody just because we put them in a good territory and they didn't work very hard and they made a lot of money, but they didn't maximize the potential of that territory. They should have been able to do twice as much or 10 times as much, right? So we list some of these factors here and we sort of say, yeah, there's context, there's the sales manager, there's the territory, there's all sorts of things that factor in to an individual sales rep's performance. And as a result, we can't really look at the raw performance number and say, yes, this is good, yes, this is bad, based purely on its magnitude, right? This brings us to a question, which is, well, supposedly the intuition is that if we set quotas and we compare the salesperson's performance to quota, that should kind of wash away all that outside variance, right? That, we set a quota using some analytics. We were very thoughtful and deliberate, and we have, the one person has a high quota because they have a high potential. The other person has a low quota because they have a low potential. And that should wash away all of these variants. And what we found in our research, and Alec will dive into this here in a minute in more detail, but what we found is that this idea of a quota is somewhat used as kind of a magic wand, a little bit of hand waving, a little bit of sleight of hand, right? To say, well, as long as we divide their performance by quota, then anything wrong with the data is now fixed. And we think that's pretty short-sighted because, again, there's a lot that goes into that quota. It could have been set using profound machine learning, doing the most up-to-date analytic techniques to set these quotas. and they could be very valid and very precise and meaningful. Or they could have kind of just asked all the sales managers in each territory to take a wild guess as to what they thought their salespeople could sell this year. And they just kind of guessed. They just kind of intuited their way to a quota. And if we don't know how these quotas were set, this can also be very misleading. So ideally, yes, that's the purpose of the quota. We should be able to set all the salespeople's performance relative to this quota, and then we can look at them, and then we can compare, right? Then it's apples to apples. But again, it depends on how that quota was set. If that quota was set consistently across each of these territories, and so on. Now, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and let Alec pull up some of the different metrics that we found in our pursuit of trying to understand how people are assessing, or how they should be assessing, salesperson performance.
Great. Thanks, Willie. So hopefully you can see my screen at this point, and we'll walk through the 4 different categories that we came up with. So realistically, the onset of this project, or the inspiration, was trying to understand this variable, or this idea of performance, particularly in a sales context. And how do you actually measure it as a manager effectively? And what types of outcomes will we be looking for? There's 4 different types or categories of performance that we identified. Partially, this is driven from managerial surveys in this case, to understand how they're measuring salesperson performance. And the 4 different categories are going to be activity-based, which is going to be looking at the activities that should lead you to some type of outcome of interest, which would be leading us to our outcome-based performance measures. So activity-based would be things like calls, meetings, that, etc., leading to outcomes like revenue or units or growth. From there, you can also manipulate these 2. So you have activity and outcome-based performance measures, and we can then convert those to see, well, how efficient are you being? So another way to say efficiency here is, how effective are you at converting these activities into outcomes? Or as you can see, we have a couple of different categories here of looking at early stage. So things like cold calls that you're making that lead to later stage activities, like meetings that should be theoretically further along in the sales process. So you can look at different types of conversions, like how effective your cold calls are at turning cold calls into meetings. And then from there, how effective you are with your meetings, converting those into actual outcomes of interest. So how efficient are you being? And then finally, we can look at the relationship-based measures. And some of those could be tied specifically to financial outcomes, things like customer lifetime value or recurring revenue, some type of upselling measure. And then we also have non-financial metrics, so things like net promoter score. So having some type of survey variable that might detail how satisfied a customer is, or how likely they are to promote your company to other people, overall loyalty that they might have. And there's some variation on the right-hand side here of the amount of, I guess, managers in this case that actually measure each of these different things, or these different types of performance, as well as some business-to-business and business-to-consumer distinctions. And so here, some of the more notable ones are within activity-based measures. You have these early stage things like cold calling. Business-to-consumer companies or managers tend to measure these and look at performance in that way a little bit more than business-to-business. And then vice versa, it swaps, where business-to-business firms seem more concerned with these later stage things like face-to-face meetings or virtual meetings that are hopefully later on in that process. The other one that I think is probably an area where more managers could begin considering are these conversions of looking at that efficiency measure to determine how effective they are if we're employing someone on an hourly basis, or looking at ways to enhance the amount of productivity that we're getting for our employees, looking at how efficient they are in their conversions from an activity measure to an outcome-based measure. So that's my quick overview. Willie, does that spark any questions or things you think we should elaborate on?
No, I think that's a pretty good categorization, description of our categorization. And what I like about the screen you're sharing right now is that it just gives you some very specific examples of each, right? You wonder, okay, well, what could I measure in the context of this company that I'm working with? What are the options? What are other people measuring? We get some very specific things like, emails or social media outreach effort, right? Inquiries handled, right? They're not going to be great for every company, but there's a lot of options. So again, painting a picture of a much more complex terrain than maybe we would expect at first glance.
Yeah. One thing that I did want to highlight is, as we were talking about good Glenda and bad Biff, one thing that we're considering in that is comparing different types of reps. And that was one distinction that we saw. And one thing that we wanted to highlight was you could look at things like the number of revenue dollars, but as Willy had alluded to, there might be some distinctions between the ability of someone to actually attain that given their territory. And that's where some of these comparative measures come in. And that sales to quota ratio here, dividing your revenue dollars by the quota that you have set for each rep, helps you compare people more effectively. So it can be an effective way, as we had mentioned, if quota was set appropriately. But with my personal experience, when I was an account manager, I literally set my own quota. So I had zero data or any type of real insight of what the actual quota should be. So when we were looking at this as a manager, if you're trying to use these comparative measures, I think it becomes much more important that you're careful about what we're actually utilizing to compare people more effectively.
Yeah, and I think that's great. Now I'm going to go back to share my screen. Can we both share screens? No, I need you to stop sharing. All right, so when we come back to this slide, I want us to look over at the right hand where it has some transformations. And in fact, they're called transformations up there. Let me scroll up a little bit. And the first transformation is what we're going to call a between individual transformation. And what that means is, it's kind of just what it sounds like, right? That I'm trying to compare the performance of one person to the performance of other people. And we can transform on, in a way that accounts for their territory by, assuming there are multiple sales reps in a given territory. Well, then we can, again, it's imperfect, but we can assume with some justification that if all of these reps are in the same territory or in a similar territory, then they all had similar performance potential. And so if we take an individual's performance and divide it by the average performance in the territory or the total performance in the territory, well, then we can start to do a little bit better job comparing. Right? We want to hold all of those other factors constant. And when we look at people working in the same environment with the same potential, they should have all been able to do the same thing. We look at it as a percentage of, or the sort of share of what was sold in that territory. And we're able to get a number that we think is a little bit better for comparative use. Again, this would work within a territory. It wouldn't work across a bunch of territories, right? Unless they were very similar and we could justify it. The other one is what we'll call a within individual. Now, this one is maybe a little less intuitive in its wording. What that means is I'm going to look at my performance in a given territory, or a single person's performance in a given territory, compared to what it was at a reasonably, a time frame in the past that's reasonable to compare it to, right? And the reason I'm saying that in such a cumbersome way is because it might not be appropriate to say, well, what's my performance this month compared to last month? Maybe there's some seasonality differences. Maybe I'm at the end of the year and things always pick up at the end of the year. But maybe it's my performance this month of this year relative to my performance in the same month in the prior year, right? To try to equalize out those seasonal effects. And by looking at that, then again, it's the same intuition going on in the background, right? That if there's something about the territory I'm in, unless I've switched territories, unless something has disrupted the ability to make that comparison, then if I look at my performance in that territory with that potential at the same time period this year and compare it to all the same, with all of the same things present in the same time frame a year before, well, there might be an argument that allows us to do better comparisons, right? Does it account for the territory? Yeah, it accounts for the territory. Right. So all we're talking about is simple division, right? We're looking for what is a great denominator to plug in to transform these metrics into something that allows us to make better comparisons and better understand, who's really doing the best with the territory that they're given.
Yeah, I think trying to bring this back pretty consistently to hopefully reiterate some of the initial conversations we had and bring this all to a nice finalization. But when we think about the good Glenda versus the bad Biff example, another way to be thinking about this beyond just territory is what's expected of the individual themselves. So with bad Biff, is it someone who is on a falling trajectory, who used to be much better, but is now starting to decline in performance, while good Glenda is fairly new in the role or potentially just starting to really get it and is now on an upward trajectory. And so we can start to understand changes in these patterns. A different way to think about this, I know you love your sports analogies, Willy. So when we think about someone like Patrick Mahomes, who is a fantastic quarterback, or there's probably a soccer or football analogy, like a European football analogy that might be more relevant for our audience here. But when we think about someone who is at the top of a professional sport relative to, let's say, my performance in that sport, we're probably not comparable in the same way. Whereas if we were to look at our own individual performance over time in that sport, comparing with our previous selves, that might give us a better inclination of how we're doing or how certain changes that are being implemented, if it's a weekly meeting that's being implemented or some type of different sales strategy that's being implemented, we can see how that is progressing change, hopefully positively, but also negatively, and looking at those types of changes as well, relative to that individual and their own specific capabilities. So I thought that was another way that we can think about this, of trajectories and change and thinking about what an individual is personally capable of.
Yeah, I think that's good. And I know when we were crafting this manuscript that there were a lot of sports analogies getting thrown around, and with our other paper on competitiveness as well, that you can think of some sports as being all about your between individual comparison, boxing, okay, within a weight class or something, where you are only winning if you are beating the other guy. And even then you might still get roughed up pretty good in the process. But compare that to something like running, where the other person can do well too, but I'm tracking my time relative to my prior performance. Or some of my kids used to do swim, you did the fastest you've ever done today in a competition. And that's a very different type of competition, a very different type of comparison. So, yeah, that's sales performance. It's a little complicated. It's not so complicated. If you're wondering, okay, so which metric do I use? What am I supposed to do with this? Well, I think the right answer in most cases is going to be get your hands dirty and play with the data and see what starts to make sense. See what aligns with what you would expect. See if you run it one way and you go, well, there's no way this person is the top performer. This person doesn't maximize the potential of his territory. Or, maybe the numbers are right and your intuition is wrong, but I think you learn a lot by getting in there and playing with the numbers and seeing what stories emerge from this process. And hopefully this figure in front of us here will give you some options on, give you some ideas on what the options are. So
I think also looking at the selling stages themselves, if you realize that maybe we're going to focus more specifically this month on one specific stage, I think that left-hand side of the model should help give you some insight into saying, okay, well, we realize our activity-based measures are lower than our outcome-based measures, are not really at the performance level that we want. We can start to identify areas that we can focus on. So I think all play a role, and I think the data helps explore that, but also gives you some insights into, as a sales manager, how you might want to begin coaching or training differently to help improve those metrics.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think I would maybe summarize that a bit by saying, the one person might not be the best across these metrics, and that's probably informative and useful, right? And normal. You might have somebody who's very efficient, but could maybe put a little more effort in on those initial contacts and bringing people into the pipeline. So yeah, there's a lot you can do with it.